Today, we're going to look at some of the processes for evaluating different items in a test. And we're going to be doing that through test item analysis, which is a series of procedures that tell you whether an item is discriminating amongst the strong and weak students, if it's too easy, if it's too hard. So let's begin. Before we talk about item analysis so that we're all using the same terms, let's look at the components of a multiple choice, and also this would be the components for a true-false test. First of all is what we call the stem. The stem is the part of the question that actually asks the question. And then there are, for multiple choice, there are alternatives. In this example, A, B, C, and D. And these are called alternatives as a group. And an individual item is going to be either a distractor or an answer. The word answer is used more often than key, but sometimes people will call the correct answer a key. So in this particular question, you have one correct answer and three incorrect answers. Now, what's really important about the distractors, which are the wrong answers, is that they be plausible to somebody who doesn't know the material. And so we do not put in ridiculous distractors. The distractors have a job to do, and that is to help you find out which students know the material and which students do not. Test blueprint is something that most of the big test companies use. Think about the National Council of State Boards of Nursing. They have a test blueprint for the NCLEX exam. And essentially what this test blueprint does is it first of all specifies the content areas that the test is going to cover, the number of test items per content area, and the difficulty level of items for each content area. And if you want to see how the National Council of State Boards of Nursing create a test plan, that test plan is at this link, this link here below, www.nclex.com/test plans page. So you can look at their test plan. It's quite long, but you can look at the test plan for the NCLEX and get a sense of what is in there. Now, for a course test, you would never have a test plan that long, but you should have a bit of a test plan for each of your tests, identifying what content that test is going to address and how many test items per content area. It won't be as extensive as the NCLEX, but it should be there so you know what content you're testing for in this particular module. Now, test item analysis is a set of inquiries about the performance of a test item. Item analysis is done to determine the quality, fairness, and adequacy of the test through the performance of the individual items on the test. Ultimately, it helps determine the quality of the test itself. The two most common questions about the performance of a particular test item are, first of all, how hard is the test item? They call that item difficulty. The second one is, how well does the item discriminate between high-scoring students and low-scoring students? And that's called item discrimination. So the characteristics of a good test is to test the student's knowledge of a content area. The test accurately measures a good test accurately measures student achievement of the competencies students need to practice the tested component in their nursing practice. In other words, you figure out what competencies the students should learn in that module, And then the test accurately tests whether or not they've learned those competencies. A test item should avoid questions about minutia, provided as background knowledge that's really not essential for students to know to practice safely. And good questions might focus on some kind of background knowledge that, as long as it's knowledge that helps the student make good practice decisions. But you're definitely not going to include questions about minor things that really the student, if they never heard them, they could still be a great nurse. Another thing we really want is for test questions, is for the test itself to be fair, so that questions on the test are drawn directly from the content taught in the module or in the course. All the items in the test should measure mastery of the material that's in the required readings, lectures, simulations, or other content specifically taught in the module or course. So if it's an on-ground course, items from the lecture are often used in tests. But what we want to make sure is that no question asks the student about something that is not covered in that module. And that's something that is really important. The possible answers in a multiple choice or true-false question are mutually exclusive. Well, true and false are kind of given to be mutually exclusive. But there should not be any overlap among the answers. So let's pretend we had some kind of question about something that is measured in numbers, and say it goes from 1 to 15. And maybe this could be children's ages. You do not want 1 to 5 being A, 5 to 10 being B. The question is, if the child is exactly 5 years old, what do you code them in, A or B or both? Because both are correct. So you need to make sure you do not have overlap amongst the questions, so that 2 or more questions may all be correct, or 2 or more distractors may be correct simply because they had overlapping numbers. So wrong answers, our distractors, in general do not include part of the correct answer. We do not look for trick questions. And correct questions don't include any component that's incorrect, because, by the way, that makes the whole question incorrect. And what I mean by we don't include parts of the correct answer, that means you don't want trick questions that a student who knows the material might get wrong simply because you tricked them in your wording or in your possible distractors. Now, these rules may seem obvious, but many tests, and most especially test questions provided by book companies, tend to have some questions that violate these principles, either overlap or trick questions or asking silly minutia that the student does not need to know. And the length of the test should also be appropriate to the amount of material presented in the module or course, which is why, in general, a final exam, it tends to be much longer than the module quizzes or the midterm exam, assuming the final exam is comprehensive. To achieve all these good test qualities, it's necessary to have a good test plan so that every question is deliberately chosen or written to identify student abilities in a certain area of content that fulfills the course objectives. It's also desirable when writing a test to note the book page, location of the correct answer on that page, or if it's in readings, videos, or lecture, what is the location of the information the student needs to know to correctly answer that question? First of all, as a teacher, that helps you a lot when a student comes in and says, no, your answer was wrong, and here's why. You'll then be able to pull out the textbook or the videos or readings or your lecture notes where the correct information was given. And students do tend to feel better if they know they genuinely got it wrong and there's evidence for that incorrectness. Finally, every item should be tested for difficulty, ability to discriminate among levels of student knowledge, and quality of the distractors. So let's look at item difficulty, and that one is real simple. It's just the percent of test takers that got the question right. Now, what you may find if you're looking at a test in a single class, then the item difficulty is just whatever percent of those students got the question right. But if you want to take a look over time at how a particular test performs across several classes, then you may find that the item difficulty is different or a little different in each of the various classes. But your interpretation of test item difficulty is, if a high percentage of the students got the question right, then the item is easy or relatively easy. The lower the percentage of students who got it right, the more difficult the item. So this is one thing that's maybe a little counterintuitive. If you have a percentage of 89, that means the item is relatively easy because 89% of the students got it right. If you have an item that 20% of the students got correct, then that's a much more difficult item because 80% of the students got it wrong. So if 20% or less of the students answered the item correctly, the item was very difficult. They kind of look at difficulty in that way. If 90% or more of the students answered the question correctly, the item was easy. So item difficulty is a real simple concept. Generally, items that score in the middle of the difficulty range are considered to be better items because they're neither impossibly hard nor so easy as to be useless in discriminating among strong versus weak learners. And I would add to this that if you make sure that that item is asking about an important component of nursing, then you also have an indicator of whether they have learned something that's going to be important to their nursing career or not. Now, there are times when a teacher may include an item that proves to be very easy for the class. And this means they learned it well. Perhaps the teacher emphasized it multiple times to make sure they know it. When I was teaching cardiology, I would present the dangers of potassium multiple times because what we all know is you never give potassium IV push because that's actually how they used to execute people. Okay, if it tests critically important knowledge or the application of essential knowledge, it may be important for the teacher to check every class on their mastery of the content represented by that item. So I always had a question related to giving potassium IV push versus putting it in fluid and letting it drip over a reasonable period of time. So I would have a question about that because potassium is such an important drug and we give so much of it in cardiac units. But there should not be a whole lot of easy items like that on the test. There should be very few of them. Generally, we would like to see item difficulty scores between about 30% and 80%, with 30% being the hardest questions and 80% being the easier questions. This is just a kind of rule of thumb. There's nothing written in stone about this, but generally they look at an item that 25% or fewer of the students got correct as a very, very difficult item. If 50% down to 37% got it correct, then it's considered a somewhat difficult item. Now, between 25 and 37%, I would probably call those difficult, but there may be something about those items that tell you that it wasn't quite as difficult as the very, very difficult. Okay, very few items should be in the very, very difficult category. Um, the score should be reasonable for a pretest, but if the content wasn't taught well, you're likely to get this percentage of students to get it right and all the others to get it wrong. And in that case, you can look at it as either I didn't emphasize it enough in lecture, or it wasn't emphasized strongly enough in some manner that students knew they have to know this. And so that's kind of how you use this chart. Now, whenever a test item is too easy or too hard, the instructor should relook at that item for how it was written. If it's too easy, that there may be nothing wrong. Perhaps the teacher just really stressed that content from which the question was drawn. But you need to look at that question. Maybe the content was foundational for other knowledge, and students recognize the importance of the content. So that's something they were studying really well. It could be that the distractors are not plausible. In that case, the item is made easy because all the distractors are so obviously wrong, there can only obviously be one correct answer. So if the distractors are not plausible, then that question needs attention because, as I said earlier, one of the key requirements of a test item is that the distractors are plausible. So let's give a little example of implausible distractors on a Med-Surg 2 test. So the STEM is a nurse comes into an obstetric patient's room and discovers the patient is not breathing and is pulseless. What should the nurse do first? Call the doctor? Well, that's pretty ridiculous. Leave the room in case the patient is merely sleeping? That's another obvious no good. Check the urine bag to see if the patient has any urinary output. I have no idea what that would have to do with the patient not breathing or being pulseless. And D, the obviously correct answer, call a code and initiate CPR. You do not want questions like this. You absolutely don't, because the distractors do not function as distractors. They just function as crazy statements so that the person can easily choose the correct answer. If the item is too hard and even the best students got it wrong, then you're really going to need to analyze that question. If the item has few or no students answering it correctly, some explanations could be the possibility that the topic wasn't covered in readings, lecture, and other materials. It might be that you're asking a question about some very minor point that students don't really need to know. Check and make sure the answer key is right. Sometimes when tests are created and put into Brightspace or any other LMS, the wrong answer gets listed as the key so that the correct answer is treated as a distractor. And if you find that has happened, then you'll have to go through the tests and correct each test because the test key that you gave for that item was wrong. And you're going to have to grade students who got it right according to the correct answer key. And then those who got it correct chose a wrong one. So you will need to do some correction on that item. Sometimes one or more of the distractors turns out to be a correct answer. It doesn't look so when you first wrote it, but when you think it through, and students will, they find somewhere in the book that says that distractor was correct. So if you get that, then the item is not a good item. And you need to either accept two or more of the answers as correct or throw the item out. And perhaps the question addresses a very minor point. The question address an obscure fact mentioned but not stressed, and students are not told this is an important piece of information. Here's an example of that. Let's say the STEM says in the third case study on page 392, what was the patient's middle name? Well, it's very difficult for me to even imagine what a patient's middle name would have any importance in a nursing test, but we don't ask questions like that. And I will say, I suppose you could if it's an open book test, but bottom line, somebody's middle name is far too trivial clinically to even bother with a question about it. So, assuming there's nothing clinically important about the patient's middle name, why would we expect students to know such a minor detail? This is trivial background information in the book with no implications for practice. This kind of question is also unfair. It's hard to determine how such a trivial question measures any course or module learning objectives. And as I said in a note, I have seen too many trivial questions produced by the book company test bank. And so I hope you'll be careful to make sure that you don't allow a question like that on your test. Now let's look at the next measure, which is the item discrimination index. And what we want our items to do is discriminate between the student who really knows the material and the students who haven't learned the material nearly as well. So what discrimination means is the item tends to be correctly answered by high-scoring students and incorrectly by the low-scoring students. Good test items should do a good job of discriminating between those students who know the material and those who don't. And that may be over multiple classes, but typically what you will see is your students who get high grades on the test itself are going to answer that item correctly, whereas students who overall get low scores will answer it incorrectly. Now, there is a formula for calculating the discrimination index. I'm giving it to you, but Brightspace calculates it for you actually twice in two different ways. And you do not need to memorize this. But basically, it's discrimination index, DI stands for that. UG is the number of high scoring takers who answered the question correctly. So your upper class, the number of your higher scoring students who answered it correctly, and then you minus the number of lower scoring students who answered it correctly, divided by n. And this is a weird n. In this n, it's the number of either students in either the upper or the lower, but not both. So it's not n as you and I usually think of n, but it's the number of students in one or the other of this group. Now, generally, what I do if I have to hand calculate this, I will generally take the top 30 or 40% of the students and the bottom 30 or 40% of the students. And if the number of students in the two group is the same, say I had 30 students in the upper and 30 students in the lower, then I would be dividing by 30, okay? And analysts often take the top 30% for the upper group and the bottom 30% as their lower group. But you don't have to worry about that because Brightspace calculates the discrimination index for you. The interpretation of the discrimination index is pretty similar to the interpretation of a correlation, in that a score of 1.0 means that all high scorers got the item correct and all low scorers got it wrong. A score of 0.0 means there is no difference between high scorers and low scorers for getting this item right. Now, if you get a negative value in your discriminating index, in other words, a value less than 0, what you will find is that the item, there's something seriously wrong with the item, because a negative value means that your low scorers got it correct more often than your high scorers. So in this interpretation, you are looking for good discrimination. And it's not that hard to get a good discrimination score. 0.35 and above is considered high or very good discrimination. 0.20 to 0.34 is considered moderate discrimination. 0.15 to 0.19 is sort of okay, not the best, but sort of okay. And then below 0.15, they are considered poor discrimination, which is 0 to 0.14. And as I said, a negative value, which means the low scoring students got that right more often than the high scoring students, means that you've got an invalid measure, that item should be either rewritten or discarded because it's not measuring anything you want it to measure. Now, I told you earlier there are two item discrimination indexes, and the one is the DI that I just showed you. The other one is what we call the point biserial correlation coefficient. All right. And the point biserial is essentially a Pearson correlation coefficient, the standard correlation, except the point biserial is modified a little bit because one of the two variables has only two possible answers, like 1 and 2 or 0 and 1. Okay, so if you want to use the Pearson correlation coefficient, you could also use this as a guide for what's good discrimination and what's not with the point biserial. Okay. So here's an example. In this example, we will select the top scoring 7 students for our upper grade and the bottom scoring students for our lower grade. And this is a single item. This is item 3. And the students got these particular grades. So the top 7 students, student 1, 2, and 3 got the answer right. Student 4 got it wrong. Student 5 got it right. Student 6 got it wrong. And student 7 got it right. So 5 of the top 7 students got the item right. Of the bottom students, we have only 2 got it right and 5 got it wrong. So to calculate that, it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 right minus 2 right equals 3. And there's 7 in each group. So that's going to be 3 divided by 7. You just take one group, the n of one group, and that gives us 42. That means this particular item does a very good job of discriminating between your high scoring and low scoring students. So this one is a good discriminator. Should it happen that the lower, I think I've already told you this, if the lower scoring students get it correct more than high scoring students, that outcome is basically considered to mean the item is invalid, and you should either discard or revise that item. So I told you about the point biserial. It's a different measure of how well the item discriminates between high scoring and low scoring students. And I will note that Brightspace, and I'll show you an example soon, Brightspace provides both the discrimination index and the point biserial measures. Like any correlation measure and like the discrimination index, the point biserial ranges from -1 to +1. And just like in the DI, a negative point biserial means the weaker students did better, and that is an invalid item. However, a point biserial score of 0.20 or higher is considered to have good discrimination. So point biserial, it should generally follow your discrimination index, but sometimes it measures lower than the discrimination index. So let's look at distractor analysis. Distractors should be written to sound plausible to the student who hasn't learned the content well. And your distractors should also be evaluated for effectiveness. As a general rule of thumb, a good distractor is going to be selected by about 5% of the students. That's called a functional distractor. Distractors that are never selected or selected by only 1 or 2 students are called non-functional distractors. So that is how you use those statistics to determine whether you need to work on your test to revise it. Let's get an item analysis from Brightspace. So the first thing you're going to do when you go to your Brightspace homepage is you're going to click coursework, and then you're going to click quizzes. When you click quizzes, it will show you quiz 1, midterm, quiz 2, final exam, whatever. So you click on the down arrow of the quiz you want to analyze. Okay, and then you click on statistics from the next menu, because that's what you want to get, are those statistics. Now, they offer several kinds of statistics. They offer user stats, which you may want to look at a particular student at some point to see how well that student is answering questions. But for our purposes, we want to get the discrimination index, the difficulty, and the point biserial. So we are going to click on question stats. All right, and this is the page that you get without any of the red. Okay, it goes question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it gives you next to it the percent of students that answered it correctly. And the blue bar also shows you the percent of students who answered it correctly. So our first question was obviously very easy. It was answered correctly by 95.45 of the students. And basically, that means almost everybody answered it right, and it doesn't discriminate between your high scoring and low scoring students. So you notice that the discrimination index is 0. The point biserial is essentially 0 too. Minus 0.08 is not very different from 0. So one of the people who missed might have been a high scoring student, but it doesn't matter. The question is too easy. All right, the next question was answered correctly by 90.91% of the students. Its discrimination index is 16.67, and the point biserial is 0.30. That tells you that this one is actually discriminating pretty well between high and low students. Because if you remember, a point biserial of 0.20 or higher is considered a good discriminator. So this is probably a good question just as it is. The next question was correctly answered by 77.27% of the students. The discrimination index is 33.33%, which is 0.3333. And the point biserial agrees it's 0.43. They agree this discriminated very well. So what you know about this particular question is that most of your high scoring students did well. They got it correct. Most of the low scoring students did not. This question is what I would call almost a super discriminator. Only 27.27% of the students got it right, but it has a 66 discrimination index and a 64 point biserial, which means pretty much the only students who got this right were your stronger students. And question 5, we go to 86% got it right. And like question 3, it was considered, it is a good discriminator according to both discrimination index and point biserial. And that is how you go through each of your questions and figure out whether or not it's a good question. Question 6 is probably not a good question. Okay. What we see here is 54.55 got it right, but it didn't discriminate at all between the strong and the weak students. You have a 0.00 discrimination index and a 0.09 point biserial. So in both places, it's a very, very weak discriminator. The same with question 7, everybody got it right. So that's a question you need to take a good look at and determine, is that one you put in there because it's something they have to know and you're wanting to make sure all the students know it? Or is it just a bad question that's way too easy and you should get rid of it? Okay. So in summary, analyzing test items is a way to evaluate the existing items and to improve the test by revising or eliminating items that do not perform adequately. The key measures include item difficulty, measured by the percent of students who get the correct answer on the test. The higher the score, the easier the item. Item discrimination is measured by either the DI measure or a point biserial correlation coefficient. The higher the score, the better the item performance in discriminating between strong and weak. Your distractor analysis should be performed to ensure that your distractors are plausible and selected by at least some of the students. Now, the reason distractor analysis is important is because poor distractors, either too easy or too obviously wrong or whatever, those can actually affect other measures of the item. So you want to make sure that your distractors are plausible and that at least 1 or 2 students in our relatively small classes, but ideally 5% of the students, select each of the distractors. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your attention, and I hope this was valuable to you.